That looks like
All right. It does, doesn't it? It's, looks exactly like me. I should have. There's a glare. Can I call for makeup? Can you? During commercial break, we'll have the makeup come in. Do a little pat. Well, welcome, and good to see everybody that's here. Looks like. Out, come on in. And there's 101. They called me last week, or a few weeks ago here he did, and said that, and asked me if I could teach for tonight's service. And I said, well, I'm on call, so if I have to leave real quick, then that's what it's for. And so somebody else can jump in, David, Ray, Willie, you can start in for next week. But do appreciate the opportunity. It's always a privilege to come and teach, and I enjoy teaching. If I hadn't went into law enforcement, I'd probably been a teacher, and that was one of my thought processes. No, yeah, I agree. Train engineer, teacher, those three I weighed, military, which I went, but so I guess we have to get done whenever we get done, but tonight's probably going to take till about 7:15, 7 o'clock, and then we'll get into prayer time after that, and so be thinking about those prayer requests, whether you're online or whether you're here in person. And I'm kind of glad that Gary asked me to tonight. I'm getting ready to go on vacation, won't be here next week, but I have been dying to do this lesson for a long time. And just it's been in the back of my mind. You get something in your mind, you think about it, you're like, hey, you know, I'd really like to just expound on this. And it's the same way when you're, especially for preachers, if you're sitting and you're listening to something and you get that, I know Willie can relate, and you're like, well, I'd like to preach that. And if you don't write it down then, sometimes you lose it. But this one has been on my heart. And if you ask Becky, I am a history person. I don't know how much she likes history, but not at all. And but I do. And I thrive on history. I love history. If I taught school, that's what I would teach. I would have taught history. And we all have our favorite subjects in history. And one of the things that I've really been going over is in the Bible are some of the metaphors that are used in the Bible, and metaphorically speaking. My last sermon at New Providence back, what was it, January, right after we closed down, we come back in. It was on the wine press where the vineyard. And the vineyard had been made. They put the good grapes. They put the wine press in the middle. And we went over that. And of course, that was an example, a metaphor of God sending His Son. The Son was beaten, ended up being killed. They killed the workers. And so we're going to go into a metaphor today. And I want you to stay with me, kind of focus, because it's been said that this is a metaphor that hit an iceberg. Anybody recognize a metaphor that hit an iceberg? Anybody ever heard that saying? Anybody know what that might be?
Titanic hit an iceberg.
Yeah, exactly. Titanic hit an iceberg. The Titanic has been used so often since it sank. And I wish I'd brought some candy or something. I'd throw it out to you, but since we're online, I can't throw it out to them. But I see a starburst over there. But that used to be my thing, is I'll throw candy out if you can answer the questions. But what I want to do, and I'm going to hand out some things where you can write them down too, is we're going to go over some metaphors related to the Titanic. In other words, the Bible verses that we can relate to, so it helps us remember. And that's what I have to have. I have to have something that will jog my memory for Bible verses. I have a hard time remembering names. Which is why I always say, hey, buddy, hey, pal. I figure the funeral of Chief Buddy Pal is going to be attended by a lot of people, because that's what I call everybody. But I'm terrible with names, and I apologize for that, up front. And so it's very difficult. I think Willie has, how many times you read through the Bible now? 562 or something? Am I close?
330.
I'm disappointed, Willie. So 330 times. Are you working on 331 now as we speak? And and that helps you memorize, right? You probably got verses, and it's very difficult. I know Jesus wept. That's one I can memorize. But it's difficult for me to memorize. It's not my specialty. It's not my strength. And so it helps me to use those things like where, you remember when Jesus used the example, and you'll know probably the chapter and verse because I'm not prepared. But do you remember when the sower sowed the seed, and some of it fell among the rocks, some of it fell among the thorns, some of it, where's that at, Willie? Put you on the spot.
I think it's in all three Gospels, but I don't know where.
Okay, that's a good answer. So that is a metaphor for a sower, but it relates back to us sowing the seed, or the preacher sowing the seed, or Christians sowing the seed of the gospel. And some of it does take root. Some of it takes root and grows, and then it produces. Some of it does not. Some of it, when the thorns and the things of life come up on us, it suffocates and it takes away. And so I'm hoping that makes a little bit more sense when I talk about when we're going to use the Titanic to memorize Bible verses. Does that make sense at all? If it doesn't, guess what? Well, then it's kind of like me vacuuming at home. Becky never asked me again because I did such a terrible job. So if I'm never asked back again, I'll know this is the terrible job. But anybody know what a metaphor is? And correct me if I'm wrong. It may be an allegory that we're describing. It may be a metaphor. But anybody know what describe or define a metaphor?
Spell metaphor.
That's it. Yeah, spell metaphor. Yeah. Webster's or Merriam says a word or phrase for one thing that is used to refer to another thing in order to show or suggest that they are similar. It's an object, activity, or idea that is used as a symbol of something else, and that's the one we're going to go with today. And I think you guessed Titanic earlier, and that's what we're going with. And I'm going to hand these out real quick. Becky will hand those out. They're all the same, and look how optimistic I was. How many is that? About 10? Just take one, pass it down. I'm sorry.
How much are they?
Hey, you'll find out then. Oh, yeah. So what I've got on here.
I gave Charles.
Power. Oh. Where is the power button?
On the bottom.
Stand by. It is not on the bottom.
Wrong way.
Do I hold it on top here? Should I see a green light? Look at that. Are we going to have to redo everything now? No, I didn't bring any pens. I do have one pen, but yeah, use that highlighter. Has anybody got, Willie, you got one for me? I need one. Will you hand me one? Will you hand me one of those, please? Oh. Oh, I've got one. I'm sorry. Who needs one?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was the only one that... I've got another one here, too. Just make sure I get it back. I stole it from work, and I need to bring it back. Where... Did you give me those back? Give me one. I need... All right. So you'll see at the top it says Bible verse and metaphor, but I want to go through with some examples first in regards to the history of the Titanic related to, metaphorically speaking, Bible verses. I got a lot of them from Proverbs. I got some of them from John and Romans, and from Chronicles, Galatians. But so you can take this, and actually you can use any metaphor, because I didn't put my metaphor that I use here, because that's I know enough about. We got them now, thanks, sorry. We just poked a few eyes out throwing these. So you put the Bible verse, and you can do it one of two ways. You can come up with the metaphor first and come up with the Bible verse, or you can do it vice versa. You can come up with the Bible verse, which is a little bit easier, and then come up with the metaphor for that. So you can use any one of them that you want to. In Jesus' day and in the Old Testament, a lot of times they would use agricultural examples because that's what everybody was familiar with. There was, up until the Industrial Revolution, we were really a rural society, farming society, agricultural society, in the same way back then. That's why you've heard the saying, putting it in new wineskins and not old wineskins because they would burst. And things like that today, we may be like, why is that? And so we may struggle when we read the Bible sometimes because it doesn't make sense to us. And so sometimes we have to figure out why their culture was doing this certain thing. Or it's just like today. I remember in today's world, my daughter was reading off. We were going through some old Army stuff. And she said, do you remember how phone numbers used to have, if it was an 800 number, it would have 1-800, and then it would have, you could spell out something. A lot of people tried it with their own phone numbers, and I can't think of any right now, but it would have a spelling, and it would have the number. Well, the number sign is obviously, hashtag. So she's reading it, and she was like, hashtag, and then the number. And I'm like, hashtag? There's no hashtag in there. Twitter wasn't. And so I looked at it and I said, that's phone number, Brittany. That's what that is. So corded phones. Anybody, they're selling those now as novelties and retro. Everybody in here used a cordless phone, right? I mean, a corded phone. We got an extension on ours because I didn't want, when I was talking on it, I would go all the way down the hallway and sit in the, little area there in the hallway and talk on the phone because otherwise you would have to sit right under the phone. And so things like that kids will not know today, same thing in here. But anybody want to take a guess at, and I'm going to pass these out too while we're here before I forget. You want to hand, thanks, sir. You going to scan those in? One more. Well, see, look at that. I don't have one now, but thank you. We can share. Yeah, exactly. She's not going to. So let me ask you this. Anybody, most everybody's familiar with the sinking, right, of Titanic. And we're going to go into a little bit of history of it first because, like I said, I like history. And then we're going to go into some of the Bible verses that I have memorized or helped me by using this metaphor. Anybody know when it sank? That's what everybody knows, right? Close. Now I'm saying the date. Anybody want to take a guess? Oh, before that.
Before that?
Yeah. Willie, you were there. What? Closer. Yeah. Yeah. 1912. 1912. It was. Well, I'm not even going to ask the month or year now. But it's funny if you look. A lot of things happen on April the 14th. Has anybody ever noticed that? Abraham Lincoln, I think, was shot on April 14th. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. My dad was born on April 14th. Titanic hit an iceberg on April 14th. So 1 out of 2 ain't bad, right? It was. It left Southampton. It was on a Wednesday, April the 10th, on 1912, and the passengers began arriving about 9:30. Anybody here taken a cruise before? A lot of fun, and this ship was massive, by the way, at the time. It was the largest ship ever built, called the Titanic. It was actually the second ship. It was number 401, where, anybody know the first ship, the sister ship to Titanic? The Olympic. Anybody knows they all end in IC, right? There was supposed to be another one called the Gigantic. The Britannic was built. These were all owned by a company called the White Star Line. And if you go to New York City, you can still go to the pier, which is Pier 59, and you can still see Cunard White Star. The White Star is up there still. It's pretty neat, and I'm surprised it's still there. She was 882 feet long, and which is actually not that big of a ship nowadays. Comparatively, it was 92 feet wide, so almost 100 feet wide. And it had a depth of 34 feet. What's your ship, or your boat, what's the depth of it? Because mine's like 8 feet. That's its depth, I think. So comparatively, it was 4 times deeper than some of the boats that we see out in the water. Just kind of give you an idea. But massive ship for its time. It was about, I think, displaced 52,000 tons of water. It weighed about 48,000 tons. A ship has to displace more than it weighs, obviously. If you're ship displaces more or less than it weighs, then it'll sink, which is what happened when it began to take on water. And has anybody ever watched Titanic, the movie? Hopefully. By the way, the movie is very, very accurate as far as the depiction. Now, Jack and Rose and all that, and by the way, Rose was the most evil person on that boat. If you haven't noticed, I mean, she's got a fiance. She's getting ready to get married. She goes to she's going to New York. She ends up meeting Jack. Has an affair with him. Then she goes, gets married. Still has the heart of the ocean, I think they called it. Then she comes on the boat, dies on the boat, but right before she dies, she ends up throwing this massive rock off into the ocean. When this guy's all he's doing is trying to find Titanic. Remember, I'm telling you, she's a villain. I'll take any arguments there, but her capacity was 2,435 people. She had 882 crew. Now, she could hold 3,300 people, but that was her capacity. That's not what she had that night. But anybody know the stops that it made before it sailed off to New York City? Never made it. I must be the only one that likes Titanic in this room. Anybody else fascinated with Titanic as much as I am? So Titanic left Southampton and went to Cherbourg, France. That's just a few hours away. Some of y'all said you've been on a cruise before. Titanic was so big that it couldn't fit into the port at Cherbourg, France. So you have to use tenders, and these tenders would come out and pick up the passenger or take the passengers there. If anybody was getting off, then they would go back to. So some people actually got off at Cherbourg, France, lucky ones, and then people got on there at Cherbourg, and then the ship went from there and headed to. Before I forget. There were two tenders that the White Star Line used. They were called the Traffic, the SS Traffic, and the SS Nomadic. And actually, the Nomadic still exists. You can actually see it. But it picked up people and dropped people off. Then it went to Queenstown, which is in Ireland, and dropped off more people. The last picture of the Titanic was taken by an individual that had been on there and gotten off and snapped the last picture of it sailing out toward New York. It was the last one that was taken, and that was on the 11th of April. Of course, 3 days later, we know that it's going to strike an iceberg. There is so much. If you just take one individual person, you can learn a lot about those individual people, and you could spend days and days. But in Queenstown, it's an interesting note. There was a stoker, one of the people that shovel coal into the giant furnaces on the ship. It had 29, by the way, boilers. 25 of them double-faced, front and rear, and the ones in the very back of the ship were single-faced. But a guy named John Coffey, not the same guy from the movie The Green Mile. I think his name was John Coffey too. But he was a stoker, and he ended up hiding in some mail bags, and he lived in Queenstown. Hid under those mail bags when they were taken off from there and got off the ship. So how lucky was that? I mean, that was the only opportunity. He would not have survived being a stoker, more than likely. It was supposed to be in Pier 59 on the 17th of April, and of course we know that at 11:40 p.m. It's going to strike an iceberg. It would sink at 2:20 a.m. ship's time, and that gets us to our lesson. What time is it, please? I hate to ask, but golly, wow. All right, I'm having to blow through this water hose. But anybody want to turn to Proverbs 1:7 for me? And we probably won't get through all of these, but anybody there?
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Okay, so Titanic hits an iceberg. It hit on the right side. They call it the starboard side. Anybody know why they call it the starboard and the port side? Nobody? Starboard side, the pilot of the ship, back in many, many years ago, they would have a board that ran down. He would steer the ship from that side. He could see better on that right side. He would steer the ship, and that was the starboard, the board side. The port side is where they would come into port, so you would go on the left side. And so that was the port side. Navy is all about tradition, so that's why, and I can tell you after we turn off why they call it the head. Army calls it the latrine. Anybody know why they call it the head? Because you went to the head of the ship, which is the front of the ship, which is where the big, they would have sometimes they would have a carved woman at the front of the ship, on the very front of it, and that's where you would go and relieve yourself if you had to use the bathroom, because the water would push up into those holes and rinse it away. So they still call it a head on the ship today. So if you don't learn anything tonight, you got why they call it a head. So Willie read, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So it hits the iceberg, right? And it goes down the side of the ship and is tearing. Now, it was riveted. Today we weld, but this was a riveted ship. They would put these hot rivets in there, nail or hammer them. And when it hit that iceberg, which is just the tip up here, now you've got all this big underneath. When it hit, it just started poking holes all the way down through there. Titanic had 16 watertight compartments, and it could survive if 4 of them were flooded. Ended up, it hit all the way back to the number 6 boiler. Boilers went, if you remember, Titanic's got 3 smokestacks, and it's got 1 in the back. Those first 3 are the only ones that were tied to the furnaces down below. The rear one was just for decoration. Because Cunard had 4 smokestacks, they said nobody will be on a 3 smokestack, so we're going to be on 4. So the boilers ran number 6, number 5, number 4, 3, 2, 1, all the way to the back. The only thing on the bottom part of the ship where this water's rushing is you got the very front hold. There's nothing up there. You got the mail room, you've got the cargo room, and then all of a sudden you've got number 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all the way to the back. Number 1 wasn't even running that night, but she was running 22 knots when it hit. So this iceberg hits, ... comes down, water starts rushing in all there, comes in through the mail room. The mail people, which is why it was called RMS, which is a Royal Mail steamer at the time. Now they're called Royal Mail ships if they have, because they're not running by steam like the Titanic was. And so they kept, remember, number 6 is flooded, and they have to shut everything down. So once they shut it down, number 5, 4, 3, and 2 are still running. Ship's warm, ship's lit, everything's fine. People didn't think that the ship could sink, and we'll get to that hopefully here in just a second. But it says, fools despise wisdom and instruction. They called for an evacuation soon after they realized that the first 5 of these compartments were flooded and it was going to come on back as well. Once that happened, they were telling people, get your life jackets on. And if you've ever seen them, they just look like squares here. They still have some if you go up to the museum. They told them to get in the boats. They were going to start lowering the boats. They ended up getting the crew to man these. They didn't have enough lifeboats, by the way. It would obstruct the view. And so they told the people to get on. But you got to realize it is freezing cold outside. And the people said, I'm going to stay on the ship. It doesn't look that bad because you can't see it. Everything's below the water line. Remember, this thing's 36 feet deep from the water line down, and everything hit below the water line. They can't see what's going on. They can't see the water rushing in. It's coming in very slowly. The other issue was there was a fire in a coal bunker down in the bowels of the ship. They had been moving coal to the other coal bunker to get the fire out. So you got to get to the fire, and it actually caused a 1 degree or 2 degree list to one side on the port side, on the left side. Remember, the iceberg hit on the right side. So as the water's coming in, it actually straightens that list out. So now your ship is sailing flat. So people see that now, we're actually better than we were, and it's going down very, very slowly by the head. People are working like crazy downstairs trying to pump this water out. There's no way that the bilge pumps can keep up, but they are trying. They actually were able to dry out number 5, and I'll tell you what happened in a minute to that. But people did not get on the boat. Why? Because the boat was warm. They didn't get on. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. They were being told, but didn't listen. Also, the number of lifeboats, there were supposed to have been, there were only enough for about half the people on the boat. And so, wisdom, if you look in the book of Proverbs, that's what it's about. Making smart and wise decisions. And when it comes to the Bible, that's where we can get our wisdom and knowledge. It seems like today we get our wisdom and knowledge from Facebook, from people that have an ounce of information about something, and we take that and run with it, and I just don't understand it. We need to do our own research, but when it comes to the Bible, if it's not in here, then it didn't happen. While we're still in Proverbs, can somebody jump to Proverbs 14:12? Yeah, please.
There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death.
Thank you. So there's a way that seems right. Sorry, I'm pulling this up here. So if you'll remember, 90 feet off of the deck is a crow's nest. There's two gentlemen that are in there, and they would rotate every 2 hours. Every 2 hours they would rotate shifts. At 10 o'clock, there were two, which was Fleet and Lee. And so Fleet is the one that is watching out for the icebergs. Remember, it's super calm. There's no water splashing against anything. It's cold out. They're shivering. They're freezing. They've got 20 minutes before they go back down, get back in the warm for their 2 hours. There's 6 people you're rotating out these shifts there's 6 lookouts, so every 2 hours. They got 20 minutes before they're done. Frederick Fleet is the guy's name. He didn't have binoculars. They ended up not having binoculars. If they had binoculars, something may have been different. And so the 2 that they relieved went down, and they had been told, hey, watch out for ice. And so, amazingly, they came on at 10 o'clock. An hour and 40 minutes later, they're, the famous words of iceberg right ahead. And, it's there's a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. If they had crashed into that iceberg straight on, running into it, probably been all right. Remember, they can survive with up to 4 watertight compartments flooded, but they didn't. They tried to do they went hard a starboard, which means you're going to try to what they call port around this iceberg. So the iceberg's here, they're coming toward it. He says iceberg right ahead, which means it's to the right of them. So he's going to kick the bow off to the left or port side, and then they're going to reverse the engines and kick the back end around. Remember, it's 883 feet long, so it's going to be hard to turn a ship. And I just got a boat, and it's not easy to learn how to kick it in reverse and pull that stern around. So they're going to turn it around that way. Such a long ship, they put and that's what he thought. And as Becky read, there's a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. This is how they'd always been taught to port around anything that's in their way. This is such a long ship, it's called a triple screw, which means you got 2 wing props out here, and you've got 1 in the middle. The 2 out here are ran by your triple expansion steam engine. Your middle one actually runs all the time until it's still running forward. They couldn't get it stopped in time in order to, and so they would probably.
Design flaw too. The rudder
Yeah.
was too small.
Yeah, exactly. Very small rudder for that size of a ship. And thank you for knowing something about Titanic. And since everybody else, I just feel like I'm just blasting y'all with a water hose here. But yeah, design flaw. So there's a way that appears right. What they say is practically unsinkable. So I know I've got my phone on now so I can see the time, but yeah, thank you. Proverbs 16:18. This is an easy one. See if y'all can figure out what metaphor I'm going for here with this proverb. 16:18.
Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall.
I already mentioned it once. Anybody know what that may go? Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. What that may be in reference to when it comes to Titanic? Yeah, practically unsinkable. Even God himself cannot sink this ship. and we don't know if that was actually said. They said that a crew, one of the workers, made that comment. It's been said that Edward Smith, who was the captain of the ship, that was his final voyage. Unfortunately, he had never had any. I mean, fortunately, he had never had any incidents, but his last one that took his life was a big one. So yeah, pride goes before destruction, thinking that it couldn't be sunk. We're not going to put enough lifeboats on here. So it's it's amazing. Proverbs 9:15. I'm going to skip a few here, but I thought this one was dead on. Proverbs 9:15. Anybody?
To call to those who pass by. 9:15?
9:15. Proverbs 9:15.
To call to those who pass by who go straight on their way.
Anybody think of what that might refer to?
Calling out to those who pass by, but go straight on their way. Do what? Do what?
Mayday.
They sent out a mayday, and there was a ship that was so close they could actually see Titanic. Before they all went to bed, they had entered pack ice, ice that is surrounding the ship. It's coming in. It's not. It's kind of a slush, and they had entered some pack ice, and they had slowed down to a stop. This was the Californian that had slowed down to a stop. They had told 70 minutes prior to Titanic hitting that iceberg. So an hour and 10 minutes before they hit, Californian radioed out and said, hey, we're in pack ice. You've got 3 large bergs before you. And the captain said, which was Captain Lord, he said, is there any ship close? And they said, just the Titanic, sir. He said, let them know. So they relayed out that, hey, there's pack ice, there's icebergs, and they all went to bed. Just turned the radio off, because when they told them that, they came on there, and he said there were 2 people manning the radio in the Marconi system that night. And he said, I'm busy, leave me alone. Because they were getting out personal messages at that time to Newfoundland. And that was, he said, hey, I'm leaving. He said, all right. So went to bed. They never saw the rockets. They thought it was stars that they saw. Remember this super clear night? They went to bed and didn't know anything about it. So that was the Californian. There was an inquiry, but there was no charges or anything that came on them. And so this is an interesting one. 2 Chronicles 15:7. We'll stay in the Old Testament for a minute. Second Chronicles 15:7.
But as for you, be strong. Don't give up, and your work has a reward.
So as for you, be strong. Don't give up. You'll be rewarded. Anybody ever heard of the baker, the chief baker on the ship? There was a chief baker. He actually made pretty good money as the chief baker. He had quite a few people under him. His name was Charles Joughin, Joughhin, I think. And when the iceberg hit, or when the Titanic hit the iceberg, he sent his crew up, his workers, and they began to throw food items into the lifeboats so that they would have it. It wasn't much, but they were throwing bread and items in the lifeboat. And so he ended up going, knowing that he was probably going to go down with the ship, ended up going and getting a bunch of rum and began to drink. If he's, going down the ship, he's, I guess he's going to take his last drink. So he had quite a bit to drink, went back on top of the ship, and now people are going in the water, and he starts throwing deck chairs off into the water. Starts chucking them in the water so that people could get to them. He is one of the last people to come off. He was back near the poop deck. They call it poop deck because poop is French for stern, or back of the ship. So he's back there. And remember, as the ship's going down, he ends up going in the water. He's in the water longer than anybody else. He ends up surviving, climbing on a collapsible boat that had come off the front of the ship, and survived. They attributed his survival to the rum that he had drank, that he didn't feel the cold. So I wouldn't recommend, if your ship is sinking, to get intoxicated, but he's known for that. But he became a hero because he had put food in, he had thrown things overboard so that for the people. You got to realize some of the testimony from the people that were in the lifeboats when this ship went down finally, and everybody's in the water. The water is 28 degrees. I don't know if you've ever experienced freezing. I've experienced 40-something degrees water caving once. And it's just shocking. I mean, it takes your breath away. So imagine even colder. It's below freezing because salt water. But the best description that I saw was a young man, I think he was 17 years old, was in the boat, and he described the sound of the people dying and screaming. He said it reminded me of the crickets or the cicadas back home. Not cicadas, but he called them locusts. And he said that sound was just so loud and deafening, it was all making the same noise, and then it just started going away. The boats did not dare go back into, there's 1,500 people roughly in the water at this time, drowning and dying. Most of them did not drown. Most of them had their vest on or their life jackets. Most of them died from shock in the water. Their body temperature would have dropped very quickly. Not to mention the injuries sustained falling off the ship. A lot of people would have had broke necks jumping in, not doing it right, and then the vests were actually not designed as they are today, but people that jumped in, some of that happened. But so amazingly, the chief baker survived and survived a long time in the water, but he was only one of very few that survived after being in the water. And so that gets us to Galatians 6:9. This may be a name that y'all are familiar with. Not in 6:9, but the one that I use as the metaphor. Galatians 6:9.
Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not.
So let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Anybody ever heard of a lady named Margaret Brown? She would be famous for being called the unsinkable Molly Brown. She got in a lifeboat, and she said after this noise of the people that were all in the water, it began to die down. The quartermaster, who was the crew in her boat, he didn't want to go. Didn't want to go back to the boat because they were afraid that people would, and even if they had been alive, they wouldn't have been able to. At that temperature of water, you lock up, you can't move, you can't. The only thing you're doing is fighting for survival. Your body is trying to take all your core body temperature, and you're not able to move. So. But she ended up threatening to throw the quartermaster, who was crewing her life raft, overboard if he didn't turn back and look for survivors. They did turn around, they went back, and I'm not sure if they found anybody alive or not. If anybody knows that, they can look it up. But she became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She was actually friends with one of the wealthiest people on board. There were four elaborate, and when I say, if you've seen the movie Titanic, then you'll know the one that where her family was in that suite, and that was it was about $100,000 in today's money to have that suite, first class suite. There were four of them on board. A man by the name of John Jacob Astor. You ever been to New York and visited the Waldorf Astoria? Anybody ever heard of that? Waldorf, they were two separate ones. The Astor was next door to the Waldorf. Astor was named after John Jacob Astor, and the Waldorf was his cousins. They were competitive. They ended up joining together. Now it's called the Waldorf Astoria, if you ever want to look that up. But he was one of the richest men in the world at the time, and which I'll read this one for you because Proverbs 6:11, since his name came up, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. John Jacob Astor stayed on the boat. He wasn't allowed on the boat. And there were two thoughts about women and children. There were two of the high-ranking officers, which were Lightoller and Murdoch. You may have heard of them. But Murdoch thought that they interpreted it differently. Murdoch took it to mean women and children first. Lightoller felt that it was women and children only. Now remember, there are one's on the port side, one's on the starboard side, and so one of them is allowing men to come on after all the women. He looks around, there's no men there to get on, like, okay, now you can come on. That's why if you'll look in your sheets there with the number of people that survived, you'll see a lot of men, not a lot, but I mean there were several that survived, and that was the reason being. On the other side, though, it was Lightoller said that it was women and children only. If you were a man, it didn't matter, and so that's why a lot of boats went down partially empty. That, and people didn't think that they were the ship was sinking. But John Jacob Astor was one that was not allowed on a boat because he was a man, and they ended up finding his body. And if you ever want to go and look, they sent out ships later. These are printouts, so you can actually print these out and look at them to see. And I'm going to tell you an interesting one of a man that used to live in Knoxville, but where they found his body. But John Jacob Astor was found on April the 22nd, so you're looking at 7 days later, and it was there was a cable ship that had been sent out to look for bodies, and he had a blue suit on with a blue handkerchief. It had AV on it. He had a belt with a gold buckle, brown boots with red rubber soles, a brown flannel shirt with JJA on the back collar, which is how he was identified. He had a gold watch. This is what he was wearing and what he had when he drowned or died of shock. Gold watch, cufflinks, gold with diamond, his cufflinks, a diamond ring with 3 stones. He had 225 pounds in English notes. He had $2,440 in American money. He had 5 pounds in gold, not pound as weight, but a 5 pound gold piece. And he had silver, 5 10-franc pieces, a gold pencil, and a pocket watch. Anybody know how much $2,440 is in 1912 money? 60-something thousand dollars that he stuffed in his pocket when he went off the ship. One of the richest men in America, which goes back to in poverty will come on you like a thief. And so all of a sudden, first class, second class, third class were all equal, floating in the water. But so let's do Proverbs 19:21, and we'll wrap up here in a second.
There are many devices in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand.
So, anybody here believe in coincidences? I don't think so. But if an airplane crashes, they call it the Swiss cheese model. And there was one crashed in San Diego not too long ago. But a Swiss cheese model, if you ever see Swiss cheese lined up, it's got all the holes in it. And if you try to stick a pencil through from one side to the other, it usually hits a block. If you go through one hole, it's never going to make it. You got 10 pieces of cheese lined up, it's rarely ever going to make it all the way to the other side. When it does, that's called the Swiss cheese model, and that's when bad things happen. Of course, as Christians, we know that things happen for God's purpose, God's reason, and we can fall back on that. But in this case, there was a ship that happened to be pretty close, and I say pretty close, it was 45, 55 miles away, and which is a little bit slow when you're having to go through icebergs and sludge, but the Carpathia, if you'll notice that, it ends in IA, which means it was a Cunard Line ship, and it ends up that Jack Phillips and Harold Bride that were manning the Marconi. They were sending out that CQD, which is SOS to us. We use SOS. They were using CQD at the time, and maybe you used SOS as well. But it's because it's really quick to tap out on Morse code, ... dash, 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 ... but they were using CQD, which was common then. They were sending this out. It just so happened, and remember those coincidences, that gentleman that was on the Carpathia was Harold Cottam. Harold Cottam knew the ones on the Titanic manning the radios, and he knew his somehow. And I mean, we know when we call people, but I don't know how you know when they're using a telegraph. I don't know how that works or how he knew, but something he knew. He went down when he heard that Titanic had struck an iceberg. He went down to the bridge and said, "Hey, Titanic struck an iceberg. They're sinking." And they said, "No, that's not true. That's not happening." Remember, we go back to earlier in our Proverbs where people don't believe it. Staying on the ship, beginning of wisdom instruction. Didn't believe it and said, "Nope, that's not true." He said, "I know it's true. I know the people on there. I know them." And he said, "I know the one sending it. I know it's true." They said, "No, it's not true." He knows it so well that he goes to the captain, wakes the captain up and says, "Captain, they've hit an iceberg. They're sinking." He said, "How sure are you?" He said, "I'm 100% sure." He orders then, full speed, going through, dodging icebergs back to the Titanic. And they get there early that morning and are able to save the ones in the lifeboats. There's nobody else that really that they can save, but they, he ends up the captain becomes a hero, and they load them all on the Carpathia and take them to New York. It takes a few days to get there, but the bridge crew didn't believe it. The radio operator, though, did. The captain did, luckily, and went. So many are the plans in a person's heart, but the Lord's purpose, that prevails. And I'm going to finish with... so you see what I try to do there. Now, Titanic is my thing. It may not be your thing, but you can use whatever you want to. You can use, boating. It's like boating or cars or anything that you like, and put those metaphors so it helps you remember whatever you call it, an allegory or a metaphor. But there's a Bible that's on display up at the Pigeon Forge Titanic Museum. Anybody been up there? Pretty neat, pretty interesting. By the way, I was a fireman. That's fireman's a stoker. I knew I wasn't going to make it. They give you a little card when you go up there, and I think you all were, second class or something, and you all made it. Don't remember. But there was a preacher his name was Robert Bateman. He lived in Knoxville at one time, moved to Florida. Anybody ever heard of him? No, but just right before the Titanic hit the iceberg, he had a Bible study that he was doing with a group of people in second class in the dining area, and he had went over a Bible study. He had his Bible with him, and just right before the impact, they were going through this. They ended up wrapping up. Once it hit, he had a relative. I believe it was, don't quote me on that, but he had a relative that got on the lifeboat. He wrapped it up in his overcoat and handed this Bible to her in the lifeboat. And of course he knew he had to stay on the boat. He did. The boat, she survived, and that Bible that he had is now on display. It's been donated or rented, I guess, for lack of a better term, to them. But the same cable laying ship that found John Jacob Astor found him as well. He had a gold watch, a chain, Masonic charm pin. He had a pair of glasses, a knife, a photo, a fountain pen, a pipe, a lighter. He had eyeglasses, and counted how much money he had. He had 4 pounds, which is like $1, be saying $4. A cigar holder and a pen. And he lived where he lived at Knoxville. If you're familiar with Knoxville, if you know where the Knoxville Museum of Art is, anybody know where that's at? You know where Sun Sphere is? And so just right there, if you're standing at the Sun Sphere and you walk west, you'll walk into the Museum of Art, and there's a parking lot, and that's where his house was. But so hopefully you can take verses from the Bible if you're like me and have trouble memorizing, and then you can put them with things that happen that you enjoy, that you like. I mean, I enjoy the Bible. I like history. I like when history lines up. You know, when you're studying the secular history of something and it lines up with the Bible, I enjoy, you know, reading about conquering and the Old Testament and some of its history. The Bible's made up of history. It's made up of biographies. It's made up of poems and songs and promises, and that'd make a good country song, wouldn't it? That sound like a good country song? It's made up of prophecies. It's made up of letters. It's just an amazing book, and I just encourage you to read it. You know, it's how many times, Willie? 330 times, and you still don't know it all, do you? You learn something, and every time you read it, you get something new, and that's what makes it a living Bible. So, any questions about that? I've given you a piece of paper. You can keep everything that I've given you, but the one that has the metaphors on it, like I said, I use this as a metaphor. You can use whichever one you want. Write it down, and if it helps you, it helps you. If it don't, be like me in vacuuming. Becky's never invited me to vacuum again. But maybe because I just threw dirt down on the ground as I was going. She's like, "You do a terrible job. Never, I can do it better than that." I forgot you were here. So, any questions regarding the lesson? All right, Willie will be here next week, right, to bring Bible study and prayer meeting. Any prayer request? Oh,
I'm sorry. You got one up there, can you see it?
Yes, under Naomi. So remember in prayer Robert Williams and Geneva Dutton. Is Robert Williams the Robert Williams we know? No? Okay. Fairly common name. Not as common as Jason's.
He's a former deacon in the church.
Robert is? Okay. So remember Robert and Geneva. And also, Connie Whitson. We need to get together. And thank you. So one prayer request from online. That
Looks like it right
all
here.
right. And so Robert Williams, Geneva Dutton. Anybody here? I know Becky's grandmother passed away, Sue, and back last Monday. And so we just had her service Sunday. So remember Lauren, that was her mom that passed away, Becky's stepmom. And remember that family. And she lived to be 92. So lived a long life. Okay, another, remember Mayla? Is that right? Mayla Baker? And,
Pamela.
huh?
Pamela.
Oh, Pamela.
Oh.
And it's Christine Beebe's daughter. And Max got a plus sign there.
I don't know what kind of code, Max.
I know. Yeah, it's an apostrophe and a plus sign.
It's
So
probably Morse code.
it's Morse code. Yeah, he's sending me a CQD. And now there we go. Now we got, it's Pamela, my daughter. And
Is that Shorty next to Max?
do what?
Is that Shorty next to
Yeah,
Max?
it is. Yeah, you can't miss Shorty over there. Anybody else? Nobody? Everything's going great in everybody's world, I guess?
Just remember my daughter Agnes.
Famous?
She is the youth leader at a church in Fairbanks, Alaska,
Oh, wow.
and she has a challenging day tomorrow.
Challenging tomorrow?
Yeah, that's all I can
Okay,
say.
all right. So remember her.
Dorothy Purdy is really not doing well at all.
Remember-
She's sick, and I don't know that they know what's causing her problem.
And I think that's half the battle. When I mean, it's when you go to the doctor and they can't tell you. And we go there for answers. And so let's pray that they find what's going on. And anybody else?
Remember Todd Bucova, he's one of my members, he's in the hospital with COVID on a ventilator. And his family just moved down from Chicago and hadn't been here 6 months. He just got settled in and has had cancer during this time, and then they got through that, got to ring the bell, and then 2 weeks later, COVID, and he's on ventilator.
Anybody else?
I have a friend, she and her husband were in our church in Pennsylvania, and she's in her 80s someplace, but she just went to the doctor and she's got cancer all through her body. Her husband was a pastor.
And
Her name is Melda.
Melda?
Mhm.
And I've got a cousin with cancer. I've got an uncle that's also dealing with cancer right now, so remember them. It's Tracy and Albert. And if I missed anybody. So remember them. Anybody else?
Is Gary on vacation
He is.
this week? Is Gary Smith's on vacation?
And we have a lot on vacation. It's, I guess now that all of our kids are out of school,
A break.
it's fall break, yeah. And so we've got two working, and one's at the beach, and we're getting ready to go to the beach, so we'll be traveling. And so I appreciate everybody's prayers while everybody's traveling and going places, and whether you're staycation or going on vacation somewhere. Just enjoy. Anybody else? Well, thank you all, and remember all these prayers. And Willie, I'm going to ask you to dismiss us, please. Remember these prayers, and we'll dismiss.
Let's pray. Father, thank you tonight that we can come together and learn another way to approach your word. I pray that you'd help us to be people who are always in your word, learning and applying it and teaching it and showing others the way. Lord, I thank you that you know these requests, Lord, for this Becky's relative. Lord, I pray that you would just touch that family and comfort them and encourage them. Lord, I know death is never easy. And Lord, for Dorothy Purdy, she needs you to touch her body. She needs you to raise her up. And Lord, Henry is getting discouraged. Would you just touch him and encourage his heart? And Lord, Dave's friend that's going through an awful time right now, would you just touch him and give Dave somehow the ability to encourage him. Just use him, Lord. And Melda, Lord, she and her husband served you for almost 40 years. And Lord, she's struggling right now. And there's not much they can do. Would you just touch her and heal her in Geneva, Lord? Thank you that she was able to have a treatment today. Would you just continue to touch her? And Lord, I pray that you'd be with Christine Beebe's daughter. Lord, you know her name. Lord, I don't know her, but you know her. You know how to be very real and near to them. I'd pray that you would be with those in our church who are on vacation. Lord, would you keep them safe, bring them back to us, that we might once again fellowship together. Thank you that we were able to be here tonight. Would you just cause us to be drawn closer and closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.